All right, so welcome everyone to this iteration of the summer 2022 New Voices series, which is overall on Châtelet, philosophy. And today specifically, we have Stephen Harrop of Yale University and Mount Holyoke College speaking on Châtelet's cosmological argument in the Institution. Take it away.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Well, first of all, thank you, Clara and Aaron and everybody else who organizes this for having me talk. So this is like a condensed version of a longer project on natural theology more generally in the Institution, specifically, obviously, in chapter 2, right? So today we're just going to be talking about the cosmological argument generally. So here's the plan of the presentation. So first, I'm just going to do some background setting, some introduction. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So we're going to do some introduction, some background setting. Then I'm going to talk about her influences. Specifically, I'm going to talk about John Locke and Christian Wolff's cosmological arguments. I was going to put Leibniz in there, but it just got too long and unwieldy with Leibniz too. So, and he gives like a slightly different argument from the ones that Locke and Wolff give. So I shunted that out, but I'm going to talk about theirs and talk about some objections their arguments are subject to. Then I'm going to talk about du Châtelet's argument and see whether she avoids the objections to which Locke's and Wolff's arguments are subject, even though hers is in many ways similar to theirs. Then I'm just going to talk about some conclusions we can draw, sort of wrap everything up. All right, so first of all, what's a cosmological argument? You know, most people probably are aware of this, but just as a brief précis, right? So a cosmological argument argues for the existence of God or a necessary being or an unmoved mover from some purported fact about experience. So for instance, change in the world is one of the classical ones, going back to Aristotle and developed later in the medieval period, right? My own existence, as we're going to see Locke and Christian Wolff both use this one. And then it makes use of a causal principle of some kind. So ex nihilo nihil fit, or the principle of sufficient reason. Play sort of key roles in those, or you know, no motion without a mover, that kind of thing. And today I'm going to be talking about the cosmological arguments offered by John Locke, Christian Wolff, and Emilie du Châtelet. So Leibniz, as I said earlier, was going to be in here, but in the interest of time, he's gotten boot. Also, his argument is more a cosmological argument from contingency rather than sort of a cogito-based one in the way that Locke's and Wolff's are. So it seemed more natural to group them separately. So first, I'm going to reconstruct both Locke's and Wolff's arguments and argue that they're both subject to powerful objections. And then next, I'll reconstruct du Châtelet's argument and argue that she manages to avoid both objections, or at least has decent responses to them. All right, so let's go on to John Locke. So Locke offers a cosmological argument in the essay concerning human understanding. I should flag at the outset, it's not clear that by argument or demonstration, Locke has precisely in mind what we would, or even some of his contemporaries would mean by a demonstration or an argument, where he talks about like demonstrations being things that lead the mind rather than being what we would call maybe a logically valid argument. But I'm assuming for the sake of this presentation, we can extract a valid-ish argument from his text, right? So here he is in the essay. I think it is beyond question that man has a clear perception of his own being. He knows certainly that he exists and that he is something. In the next place, man knows by an intuitive certainty that bare nothing can no more produce any real being than it can be equal to two right angles. If, therefore, we know that there is some real being and that non-entity cannot produce any real being, it is an evident demonstration that from eternity there has been something. Since what was not from eternity had a beginning, and what had a beginning must be produced by something else. Okay, so this here's a reconstruction from Marcy Lascano's paper on du Châtelet's and Locke's argument. I think Lascano is here. Great paper, really liked it. So here's the reconstruction. I've made sort of like cosmetic changes. So premise 1, I exist, right? Pretty straightforward, the cogito. Conclusion 1, there exists some real being from P1, assuming that I am a real being, right? Premise 2, non-entity cannot produce real being, so this is basically an ex nihilo nihil fit premise. And then conclusion 2, something must have existed at all times from eternity. This is supposed to follow from conclusion 1 and premise 3. Now, here's a problem. The conclusion of the argument, C2, is ambiguous between the following two propositions, right? So remember, that was something must have existed at all times from eternity. That could be given one of two readings. One, some particular thing must have existed at all times from eternity, right? that's C2 prime, and then C2 double prime, some, but not necessarily the same thing, must have existed at all times from eternity. So here's sort of a way to distinguish the different ways in which the conclusion can be read, right? So here's a way to illustrate the difference. Consider a world with a chain of infinitely many contingent beings stretching infinitely into the past, which meet these conditions. So being B1 exists from, T minus 1 to 1, being B2 from T minus 2 to 0. So they're like stacking and overlapping their existences, right? ... Being N exists from negative N to 2 minus N. And then star being Bn brings Bn1 into existence. So like you've got this chain of beings, each one brings the next one into being, and then their existences overlap a little bit, right? So it's pretty clear here that C2 prime is violated. Nothing's existed from eternity because things only exist temporarily, but C2 double prime is not, right? Because something exists at all times because the existences are overlapping, right? So there's no time at which nothing exists. And so if Locke's argument is supposed to be a cosmological argument, it fails. It doesn't show there must be a first cause or a being which has existed from all eternity or something like that, right? All it shows is that there was never a time when there was nothing, right? It shows either at every time some unique thing has existed or that at every time some not necessarily unique things existed. So Leibniz makes basically this point in the New Essays, right? Quote, I find an ambiguity in the conclusion of the argument. If it means that there has never been a time when nothing existed, then I agree with it. And it really does follow with entirely mathematical rigor from the preceding propositions. But you go straight on in a way which shows that when you say that something has existed from all eternity, you mean an eternal thing. But from what you have asserted, it does not follow that if there has always been something, then one certain thing has always been. That is, that there is an eternal being. Okay. So is there a way to patch this argument? So we'll see later whether sort of du Châtelet's take on the argument works. All right, so now let's move on to Christian Wolff's cosmological argument. He gives cosmological argument in at least two places, the Theologia Naturalis and the Deutsche Metaphysik. So here's an argument from the latter. Choosing the Deutsche Metaphysik, or the rational thoughts, is because that's the one that we have best reason to believe that du Châtelet was aware of, right? We know she read Locke thoroughly. Voltaire said she knew Locke better than he did, et cetera, and it's most likely that she had access to the Deutsche Metaphysik. She might have also had access to some parts of Theologia Naturalis, but I'm just going on what we have best reason to believe she had access to. So here's the argument from the Deutsche Metaphysik. We exist. Everything that exists has its sufficient ground why it exists rather than does not exist, and therefore we must have a sufficient ground why we exist. If we have a sufficient ground why we exist, that ground must be found either within us or external to us. If it is to be found within us, then we exist necessarily. But if it is to be found in something else, then that something else might have in itself its ground why it exists and thus exists necessarily. Accordingly, there is a necessary being. Whoever might object that the ground for our existence could be found in something that does not have in itself the ground for its existence, does not understand what a sufficient ground is. For one must in turn ask further of such a thing, what has the ground for its existence? And one must ultimately arrive at something that needs no external ground for its existence. This is section 928 of the Deutsche Metaphysik. Okay, so here's my reconstruction of that argument. So premise one, I exist. Premise two, the principle of sufficient reason, basically. It's conclusion one, there is a sufficient reason why I exist. Okay. Premise three, my sufficient reason is either in me or in something else. Premise four, a necessary being has a sufficient reason inside itself. That's just what it is to be a necessary being, right? Conclusion two, if the sufficient reason for my existence is in me, then a necessary being exists. This follows from P4 and from P1 too, right? Premise, this should be premise five, it's misnumbered, I apologize. If the sufficient reason for my existence is not in me, then it is in something else. This follows from P3, right? Because it's just disjunctive syllogism. And then this should be P6 again. There cannot be an infinite regress of sufficient reason havers that don't contain their sufficient reason in themselves, right? You can't have an infinite chain of things which are not self-existent or necessary, which are all contingent, basically. Then conclusion three, if the sufficient reason for my existence is not in me, then it must lie in some necessary being. This follows, it's supposed to follow from premises 6 and 7 with some hand waving in between about the infinite chain, right? And then conclusion 4, a necessary being exists. All right, so that's my reconstruction of Wolff's argument here. So there are at least 3 problems with this argument, right? The first one, it gets us that either I'm a necessary being or that something else is, not that God exists, right? Number 2, why must that thing be extra mundane, supernatural, right? Why can't there be a necessary being that's like part of the world or maybe consists in the world, the way Hume as we're not going to see exactly, but like in part 9 of the dialogues talks about like maybe the world is the necessary thing, right? Now, these 2 are dealt with explicitly or implicitly later on in both works, right? So he has some discussion about why, that thing has to be God, why it has to be outside the world, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not going to look very closely at these objections. We are going to look, however, at a third objection, which is what I'm going to call Hume's problem, right? So remember, here's what Cleanthes says in part 9 of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion about the cosmological argument. So probably the one Samuel Clarke gives, right? So just as a recap, right, the dialogues is just Hume bashing natural theology, but then sort of backing into, well, maybe the design argument is okay, maybe it's not, whatever. So Cleanthes is a little wishy-washy there at the end, right? But basically it's Hume's take on natural theology and other stuff related to natural religion, right? So here's his objection to the cosmological argument. In such an eternal succession of objects, right, this infinite chain that Wolff was talking about, and that we saw in part is caused by that which preceded it, and causes that which succeeds it. Where then is the difficulty? But the whole, you say, wants a cause. I answer that the uniting of these parts into a whole, like the uniting of several distinct countries into one kingdom, or several distinct members into one body, is performed merely by an arbitrary act of the mind and has no influence on the nature of things. Did I show you the particular causes of each individual in a collection of 20 particles of matter, I should think it very unreasonable, should you afterwards ask me, what was the cause of the whole 20? This is sufficiently explained in explaining the cause of the parts, right? So it's this nominalism about wholes. So he also talks about this a little bit in, I think it's Treatise 1223, right, where he talks about it a little bit. It's the bit about numbers and unities and stuff. Okay, so here's the basic problem. The whole, in this case, the whole causal series of the world, just is all of the parts. It's nothing over and above that requires a separate explanation to it, right? So if every part has a sufficient reason, that's sufficient to explain the whole, right? What's the explanation of the whole? It's just the conjunction, sum, collection, whatever, just all of them taken together of the explanations of the parts. Quote, this is where I'm taking this from, where he says at the very end, this is sufficiently explained, this being the whole, in explaining the cause of the parts, right? Consequently, so nothing outside the causal series is necessary to explain the entire causal series. All we need to do to explain the entire causal series is explain each link in the chain. As a result, premise 7 is false, right? So premise 7 said that there can't be an infinite regress of non-internally having sufficient reason happens, right? So there can't be an infinite regress of beings, none of which contains their sufficient reason internally, right? Which has it from an external cause. So Hume says B7 is false. So the argument is invalid. So Wolff, I don't think Wolff has a terribly good answer for this, at least in this passage. He essentially just asserts that one must ultimately arrive at something that needs no external ground for its existence. And it's not clear to me why he would say that, just on the basis of what he says here in the passage and sort of elsewhere. So elsewhere, he defines a sufficient reason or ground like so. This is in section 30. When something is present from which one can comprehend why something exists, that thing has a sufficient ground, right? So when I've got an explanation for the existence of this little phone charger thing, I've got a sufficient reason for it. Okay. So if I have an external cause, if I have an external cause, why doesn't that fulfill the definition, right? As far as I can tell, Wolff is kind of just pounding his fist on the table here. He's just saying, no, you don't understand, but doesn't seem like he's got good principled grounds for saying that you don't understand, at least not to me. So here's like a summary of what we've done so far. So we've seen 2 main problems so far. First is Locke's equivocation. Why think the same thing must have existed from all eternity? Why can't you have lots of little overlapping things and still have that something, though not the same thing, has existed from all eternity? And there's Hume's problem. Why think there can't be an infinite regress of sufficient reason havers that the whole series is nothing over and above all its parts, and that an explanation of the whole is just the conjunction or sum or collection or whatever of the explanations of the parts, right? You've got a perfectly, it seems like a perfectly coherent alternate view, right? What principled ground does Wolff have for rejecting this? So now we're going to look at Emilie de Châtelet's argument and see whether it gets around these two problems. I'm going to argue roughly that it does, or at least in the case of the second one, shifts the dialectic in a favorable way for her. Okay, so let's look at the text. So du Châtelet begins the second chapter of the Institution de Physique by saying the following, quote, the study of nature raises us to the knowledge, connaissance, of, and I'm going to have to speak some French in this talk. I apologize for my pronunciation. It's horrible, but, you know, I was going to say c'est la vie, but that's just an instance of it, right? To the knowledge of a supreme being. This great truth is more necessary, if it is possible, to good physics than to morals, and it must be the foundation and conclusion of all the researches which we make in that science. She goes on to give a broadly Lockean, Wolffian, sort of a hybrid of the two cosmological argument, and a broadly Leibnizian contingency-based cosmological argument. So we're going to deal with the former for reasons of time, just the one that's sort of like a hybrid of the Locke-Wolff argument, right? And Wolff's argument shows obvious influences of the Lockean argument, right? Because he starts with the cogito. Okay, so here are the steps of the argument in her own words. The actual passage is too long to reproduce here. So step one, something exists. Step two, it is necessary that something has existed from all eternity. Step three, the being which has existed from all eternity must exist necessarily and not have its existence from any cause. Step four, so that's basically where step three is where the Lockean-Wolffian argument stops, and now starts the Leibnizian argument. Step four, there is nothing but contingency in all the beings which surround us. Step five, everything that exists has a sufficient reason for its existence. Step six, it is necessary that a being's sufficient reason be either in it or outside it. Step seven, the sufficient reason cannot be found in another contingent being, nor in a sequence of these beings. Then step eight, it is necessary to come from this to envenira, a necessary being which contains the sufficient reason of the existence of all contingent beings and of its own, la sienne. Okay. So that's in her own words. I've translated that from the 1740 edition, the first edition, right? I think it's the Profil, who are the printers. So here's my charitable reconstruction of Lockean-Wolffian argument given in steps 1 through 3. So premise one, something exists, right? Premise two, if something exists, then something must have existed from all eternity. Conclusion one, something, S, a particular thing, must have existed from all eternity. Conclusion two, S has existed from all eternity. So you might wonder why I've got C2 in there. Well, that's just because I've got to discharge the must, right? This is just, again, me making it as sort of pedantically step-by-step valid as I can, right? So premise three, if S has existed from all eternity, it is uncaused and exists necessarily. Conclusion four, it should be conclusion three, S is uncaused and exists necessarily. Okay, it's a valid argument, right? But is it sound? Are the premises true? So what arguments does she give for each premise? How does she argue for each premise? So for premise one, which remember is just something exists, she basically just proceeds from the fact of the cogito, just like Locke. If I exist, something exists, right? Pretty straightforward, hard to deny. Even if you deny there's like a self, like whatever it is the I refers to, unless you're like Anscombe, who thought that the indexical is just, I think, if I recall our review correctly, just non-referential entirely. You think that I exist refers to something, right? Premise two, if something exists, then something must have existed from all eternity. Okay, so here's the quote. Without my insertion, a being that has existed from all eternity, it would be necessary that nothing, which is but a negation, would have produced all that which exists, which is a contradiction in terms. For it is to say that a thing has been produced and at the same time not to recognize any cause of its existence. So that's the way she argues for premise two. So it's a little difficult to make sense of what precisely she's arguing, partially because it's like so terse, right? It's just two sentences, basically. So I think something like the following is going on. So she thinks the series is what we have to link in the causal chain, right? Because remember, she says all that which exists, whatever, you can see the French, all that which exists, right? So it's on the second and third line, right? This would suggest that we can infer a particular thing that has existed from all eternity and has created the series, right? Because it's not just like every link in the causal chain, it's the entire series. It has to have been able to produce the entire series, so it has to have existed from all eternity, is the basic idea. So notice that du Châtelet isn't committing the error of reifying nothing, right? To say the proposition nothing produced all that which exists is absurd. One doesn't have to presuppose that you can attribute properties to nothingness, right? It's just equivalent to quote, not recognizing any cause of its existence, right? So again, like that's a very pedantic quibble, but I figure let's be as pedantic as possible. We are philosophers after all. So let's just step by step. Okay. So this, potentially anyway, does away with Locke's equivocation. Something must have existed from all eternity because even if there were a causal chain like the one we saw earlier, right, in the example that was like a counterexample to Locke's, the causal chain itself would still need an explanation, right? And if it didn't exist at all times or atemporally or whatever, it couldn't explain the entire series. Okay. But now we run into Hume's problem, right? Why think that the entire series would need an explanation? So one possible answer is something like the method of particularization. So this gets deployed by like medieval Islamic natural theologians such as al-Baqillani, al-Jawaini, and al-Ghazali, as well as like Maimonides and some other people. So the basic idea is, given equally possible alternatives, one must explain why this one and not another one occurred. Something has to tip the scales, right? So this line of defense is open to du Châtelet, of course, because she endorses the PSR, right? So you can say there must be a reason for everything, why it is rather than it's not. So why this thing rather than another thing? Because, I don't know, God's choice of creation, something like that. Now, that's a speculative line of defense because I can't find her saying specifically stuff like that, but it's not unheard of at the time. So here we have, for instance, Spinoza in letter 34. Quote, if some definite number of individuals exists in nature, there must be one or more causes which are able to produce precisely that number of individuals, neither more nor fewer. For example, if 20 men exist in nature, to avoid all confusion, I suppose that they exist together and without predecessors in nature, it will not be sufficient to give a reason why the 20 exist. It will not be sufficient to give a reason why the 20 exist to investigate the cause of human nature in general. What must also be investigated is the reason why neither more nor fewer than 20 men exist. Not clear where Spinoza is getting this. Maybe he got it from Maimonides or from other medieval Jewish philosophers with whom he might have been familiar. But he uses basically this method of particularization, right? So it wasn't unheard of at the time. It wouldn't be an anachronistic thing to attribute to du Châtelet if we wanted to sort of charitably supply it. All right, so let's move on to premise 3. If something has existed from all eternity, it is uncaused and exists necessarily. So here she has this big quotation. If, quote, if the being that has existed from all eternity were to have received its existence from another being, it would be necessary that that other being existed through itself. And then either it is of that being I speak, and it is God, or else it would again have had its existence from another. One easily sees that in thus going back to infinity, one must either arrive at a necessary being which exists through itself, or else admit an infinite chain of beings, which taken all together will have no external cause of their existence, since all beings enter into that infinite chain, and which, each in particular, will have no internal cause, since each does not exist through its in a gradation to infinity. Thus, this is to suppose a chain of beings which separately have been produced by one cause and which altogether have been produced by nothing, which is a contradiction in terms. Again, not entirely clear what's going on, but I'm going to try and give a hypothesis as to what's going on in a second. So what's going on here? Primarily, right, she's arguing for P3, right? She's giving an argument that the being that exists from all eternity must be necessary, either uncaused or self-caused, depending on how you want to cash it out, being. And she's doing it in a way that I think is notably different from Wolff, in that she gives reasons rather than just stipulations why there can't be an infinite regress of such beings, right? Because it implies a contradiction, not just because, oh, you don't know what sufficient reason means. But secondarily, and this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting, it seems like she's giving, though perhaps unintentionally, another potential response to Hume's objection, right? So the basic idea goes like this. Suppose Hume is right, and the whole is nothing over and above its parts. It's just the parts. And that the explanation of the whole is nothing but the conjunction or sum or collection or whatever of the explanations of the parts. Then each particular thing has an external cause and no internal cause. And the conjunction or sum, collection, whatever of these external causes explains the whole. Okay, now, if there is an explanation of the whole, it must be internal to the whole or external from it. Those are the options, right? But there cannot be an external explanation of the whole since there's nothing external to it. So recall from the quote I just read, quote, since all beings enter into the infinite chains, what we've assumed, right? And there cannot be an internal explanation of the whole, since that would have to be one of the parts, which would then explain itself. Quote, since each does not exist through itself and have all their existence the one from the other in the gradation to infinity, right? So which would then explain itself. That contradicts the assumption, which is that they don't have internal explanations. So what do we get? The whole is at once explained, right, by the conjunction, sum, collection, whatever, and not explained, since it can have neither internal nor external explanations. Quote, this is to suppose a chain of beings which separately have been produced by one cause and altogether have been produced by nothing. And that is a contradiction, right? Both is explained, isn't explained. So that's another way of reading what's going on in that argument. It's like a tacit response to the Hume objection, the Hume problem. So how can the defender of Hume's objection respond here? I think the most promising line seems to be is that instead of saying that the explanation of the whole just is this conjunction or sum or collection or whatever of the parts, you just say that the whole is not apt for explanation, right? There's, it's just an inapposite question to ask what explains the series, right? It doesn't make sense, that kind of thing. So this would amount to a denial of the full-blown PSR, I think, right? Some things are not apt for explanation. So what move can du Châtelet make here? So she says, Hume, I've got this objection to your objection, right? Which is that if I assume that the whole is just explained by the conjunction of the explanation of parts, I get led to a contradiction. Then Hume says, okay, then I just deny that the whole is something that needs explanation at all. So I reject one of the premises of the reductio, which doesn't help you, right? So what move could du Châtelet make here? Well, one, she could just fall back on particularization, right? Again, we're being speculative here, but it's not a totally out of the realm of possibility speculation. If the things in the world are contingent, then they could have been otherwise. What explains why they are the way they are and not some other way? Two, is just argue directly from the PSR. She, in fact, kind of does this in chapter 1 of the Institution, right? Where she talks about the principles of her knowledge. She talks about like principle of contradiction, PSR, the principle of identity. I think it's every one. So she sort of does this in chapter 1, right? In either case, though, here, she shifted the dialectic away from the Humean objection. She has an answer for it, right? One that forces the Humean to revise his position. So I think that she's shifted the dialectic to more favorable ground in her argument, the way I'm reading it, than Wolff would have been able to do with his argument, or just did with his argument, right? Okay, so here are my conclusions from what we've seen. What have we seen in this topic? So first, I think Locke and Wolff give similar, though obviously not identical, cosmological arguments, but each is subject to distinct, powerful objection, right? In Locke's case, it was that, well, why does the same thing need to have existed from all eternity? Why couldn't it just be something but not the same thing? And in Wolff's case, it was Hume's problem, right? Why not just think that there can be an infinite regress of contingent beings, each of which is the sufficient reason for the next one in the chain, right? Du Châtelet, here's the second thing I think we've seen. Du Châtelet gives an argument broadly along their lines, but I think has strong resources to resist both objections, right? So she gives an argument for why you would need to think that a thing that that there is some particular thing that has existed from all eternity, right? Because it's not merely the things of the chain, but the series as a whole that needs explanation. And then she has her little argument, her little reductio, possible answer to Hume's problem, right? So I think she has strong resources to resist both objections. So I conclude Du Châtelet's argument represents an improvement over both affairs, though not an impregnable one, right? You can still poke it, as we saw. Maybe the Humean can deny that the whole is apt for explanations entirely, but then Du Châtelet can make some other moves, right? She has other resources at her disposal, and that's it. Thank you.